Pray for the Pope. But my
Yes.
question to you is, you mentioned how you are in communion with all these other mainline Protestant churches. So for me as a
Yes.
Catholic, I see Leo the 14th elected today, and I see in him the visible source of unity for the church, right? So it's like if an alien came to Earth and said, "Who's in charge here?" I'd be able to go, "This guy," and he has the final say. Maybe he makes the right call, maybe he makes the wrong call, but he's the captain of the ship, he's in charge. So for me as a Catholic, it's very easy for me to see why I'm in communion with people in Africa, Asia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How, in what way do you have visible unity with all those other mainline Protestant churches that you said you're in communion with? Because it seems like you're different churches because you have not just different practices, which is okay, right? Like I'm Western Catholic and they're Eastern Catholics. We practice things differently. That's fine. But you have fundamentally different beliefs on some core issues, or would you not say that's the case?
So, no two people have exactly the same beliefs. All of us have to recognize that there's a difference between essential and non essential beliefs. And I believe that all the mainline Protestants share the same essential beliefs. The things we disagree on, we all agree that those are not essential beliefs. For example, infant baptism or predestination, those are not essential beliefs for us. And I know that predestination is not an essential belief for Catholics either, because the Catholic Church allows a variety of interpretations on what predestination means. That's
Well,
why
the,
we'll
the
have some.
difference would be with predestination. Predestination you have to believe in, but how that exactly works in people's life is where there's different schools of thought,
Yeah,
right? Like if
and the
somebody
same
said
is
predestination doesn't exist, be like, okay, well the Bible says it does.
yeah,
the
yeah,
Pope say it do, the councils, exactly.
and no Protestant church says predestination doesn't exist, but there are Calvinist and Arminian Protestant denominations who are in communion with each other. Now, what does it mean to be in communion? We call it altar and pulpit fellowship. That means we can take communion at each other's churches and we can share pastors with each other. For example, the pastor at my old church back in New York, he was originally ordained in the RCA, the Reformed Church in America. It's the Dutch Reformed denomination.
RCIA?
Nope, sorry. RCA,
I'm just
which
kidding.
is the
I'm just
Dutch
kidding, bro.
Reformed mainline denomination, but he was able to just transition into the PCUSA, no problem, because we're all in communion with each other. Mainline Protestantism is like Eastern Orthodoxy minus the exclusivity, where there's multiple jurisdictions that are all in communion with each other. And I would agree with Eastern Orthodox apologists when they say that's more how the early church looked, where there was less universal jurisdiction of the Bishop of Rome. I personally believe that arose as sort of a side effect, a leftover aspect of the Western Roman Empire. When the Western Roman Empire fell, it's funny, the first pope to really exercise universal jurisdiction was Leo the First. Now we just got Leo the 14th. He was the first pope after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. He sort of filled the void that everyone wanted of a really powerful, centralized leader in Rome. So that's my interpretation of how that happened, how the Bishop of Rome became so powerful. But it really does seem like the Eastern Orthodox are right when they say that the model of unity in the early church was more regionalized, and it wasn't like there was one elder who was above absolutely everyone else.
Okay, interesting. So you think that Leo, which ties into what we were originally going to talk about, RZ and I were originally going to talk about how Mary is the mother of God and
Yes.
how Nestorianism is bad. But then the Pope got elected, and I was like, all right, we gotta shift to something else here. It's
Yeah.
like this is what everybody is thinking about, so we got to talk about it. And thank you, RZ, for being flexible on that. Really appreciate
Sure.
that.
I still
Um,
want to talk about Nestorianism because that is a thing that we have to band together against.
I
But yeah.
couldn't agree more. We can get to that. We've got a little bit of time here,
And the new
certainly.
pope is named after Leo the First, and Leo the First he wrote the tome that condemned both Nestorianism and monophysitism. So
True, true. Council of Ephesus, yeah,
no,
very true.
Council of Chalcedon.
Yeah, correct. Good job. Well done. I wanted to, though, real quick, talking about. So essentially, you would say that the Roman papacy, the way that we conceive it today, started with Leo in the 5th century ish.
No, I think it has developed in many stages over time, but I think a big milestone was Leo the First because he was like the hero of the Council of Chalcedon, and he really was. He was very important, and he was also very important in protecting Rome from the barbarians. So
Right.
Leo the First is called Leo the Great for a reason. He really was great. But I think after him is when people start to see a large dependence on the Bishop of Rome specifically. So I don't think Leo the First was like a modern pope because the Pope wasn't defined to be infallible until Vatican I. I'm well aware lots of people believed in papal infallibility before Vatican I.
Mm-hmm.
But for example, the Council of Constance says that councils are above the Pope in Haec Sancta, but then Vatican I in Pastor Aeternus says the Pope is above councils. So I think we don't really see the modern papacy until Vatican I, but I think Chalcedon with Leo I was a big milestone in elevating the Bishop of Rome above other bishops. Also, another reason for that is that the Patriarch of Alexandria was also called the Pope. That's why Athanasius was called Pope Athanasius. But the Council of Chalcedon excommunicated the Alexandrians. So after the Council of Chalcedon, there was only one Pope in the church when previously there had been two.
Yeah, and they still call their leader the Pope today,
yes.
if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So you're talking about this centralization of the papacy happening in stages, right? More or less, and a big watershed moment perhaps would be Leo. Is that the way you would phrase it more?
Yes.
Okay. I'm sure you're aware, but just with all the evidence, the famous quote from, or passage, I should say, from Clement I, who's the Pope in the 1st century, writing to a church in Corinth and saying that you need to be, I'll paraphrase here, but saying you need to be obedient to us or else you will be involved in a grave sin. And then you have, Irenaeus in the 2nd century saying that because of the Church of Rome's superior origin, it's a matter of necessity that all other churches agree with her. Then you go into Cyprian of Carthage, right, in the 3rd century, maybe around 250, talking about how Christ established one chair, the chair of Peter, and that anyone who's not in, once again, these are paraphrases, I can pull up the exact quotes if you'd like, but essentially saying that communion with the chair of Peter, if somebody doesn't have that, how can they be sure that they're in the one true church? You go on to St. Optatus in the 4th century. St. Optatus makes very clear that the chair of Peter is one of the essential characteristics of the Catholic Church. And, we can talk about what the word Catholic Church means, right? Because I'm sure in a certain sense, you and many other Protestants who know what's going on would say that we are part of the Catholic Church. So we could talk about that. But you see Augustine talking about how the succession of bishops from Peter down to the Pope of his present day is one of the main reasons he remains in the church. So it's like, I see how practically there is certainly a development where the papacy starts to grow in power and it starts to exert its influence over other areas of the country or the world more prominently. I see that certainly. But I also see in the writings of the fathers from the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, I see them saying things that strongly indicate to me that the Pope has the final say. The Pope has some sort of supreme authority. And perhaps you wouldn't object to that, but you would say that he used that supreme authority in such a bad way that people were morally obligated to rebel like Luther did. So I'm just curious what your take on that would be.
Yeah, 3 things. Number 1, I would object to supremacy. I wouldn't object to the primacy of the See of Rome. That was universal in the early church, and the Eastern Oriental Orthodox don't deny that. What they object to is supremacy. The Bishop of Rome was often used for appeals, but so were other bishops like Alexandria, for example. Now, regarding the Irenaeus quote, Rome had a reputation for being very orthodox compared to other cities. Like, that's why the letter of Romans is much less critical than the letter to the Galatians or the Corinthians, for example. So in the PCUSA, there's a lot of controversy about like gay marriage, for example. And repeatedly, some of the most orthodox presbyteries are the ones in Pennsylvania. So I have said to people in the PCUSA, all the presbyteries must agree with Pittsburgh because of Pittsburgh's noble origin. It has a very, very prominent history, American church history. And Pittsburgh has a reputation for being very orthodox. First Presbyterian Church Pittsburgh is this beautiful cathedral-looking thing. It's not literally a cathedral because we don't have bishops, but it looks beautiful, and it's very historic, and they stand firmly against the new measures to try and make room for same-sex marriage in the PCUSA. So I could say all presbyteries must agree with Pittsburgh. That doesn't mean I believe that the pastor of First Presbyterian Church in Pittsburgh is Pastor Aeternus, is the pastor of the universe with not just eternal but also temporal supremacy over princes and rulers.
Okay, I see. Yeah, I think that's a very similar argument to what the Eastern Orthodox would say, is that Rome has a primacy and they have a very good track record. Like, they just tend to get things right, so you should agree with them. But
or
they
at
don't
least
take
did
it
in the early church. That's what we would say.
Of course, yeah. For the first, let's say, 5-6 centuries or what have you, they have a very good track record, and so you ought to agree with them. But they think that it's more of a matter of chance, maybe not chance is the right word, but it's a matter of circumstance that they happen to be right over the course of the first 6 centuries. Whereas
Mhm.
Roman Catholics look at that data and go, wow, for 600, 700 years straight, the Roman Catholic Church remained Orthodox and every other major see fell into error, right? Nestorius, all these other heresy arcs, all that going on, but only Rome remains pure for the more or less for the first 600 or 700 years. And so we interpret that data as there being some sort of a positive promise, some sort of something that's preventing the church from falling into error, right? So, yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
Right. I mean, that's one way to interpret the data, but the Eastern Orthodox would say, oh, Rome was one patriarchate and there were four others. And during the Great Schism, four were on our side and only one was on their side. I've heard Eastern Orthodox make the argument that every time there's been a major split, either with the Nestorians, the Monophysites, or the Latins, it's been four patriarchs on the Orthodox side and just one patriarch on whatever side split off from them. So that is one way to look at the data. There's many other ways to look at the data. So I don't think trying to draw a line based looking at the historical data is the best way to determine what our ecclesiology should be. I think our ecclesiology should come fundamentally from the scriptures, and Presbyterians believe in covenant theology, where the Old and New Testaments are really part of the same overarching covenant. That's why if you read the Scottish Westminster Divines, when they're basically describing Presbyterian polity, they use the Old and New Testament interchangeably to argue for it. And they also do appeal to the Apostolic Fathers for ecclesiology as well, with the equality of elders and bishops and all that. But we could talk about something else if you want.
Yeah, no. Yeah, well said. Yeah. So I'm curious too with what you just said. You admitted earlier that you don't have a bishop. I think that's what you said. You said we don't have a bishop.
Yes.
Um, does that bother you at all? Because I see in the early church, Saint Cyprian says the bishop is in the church and the church is in the bishop. Saint Jerome talks about, no, excuse me, Saint Ignatius talks about how where the bishop is, there is Jesus Christ, there is the church,
Mhm.
right?
And he's
So
absolutely right about that. I
it's
know I'm sounding confusing. We
oh no,
don't
no, I would love to hear some clarity on that though, because like to me, it's like the church is preserved through the lineage of bishops, and
Mhm.
bishops come from bishops. So as soon as you break that line, this is obviously just apostolic succession, super simplified version of it because we only got an hour here, but more or less, you have to have that succession from the bishops in order to have a valid church. Sounded like, maybe I'm wrong, but it sounded like you said you don't have a bishop. So for me, that would be like, okay, well that church is invalid. But I would love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, so when I said we don't have a bishop, we don't have bishops in the modern sense of bishops. So we believe that the definition of bishop has drastically changed over time. In the New Testament, bishops and elders are the same office. Peter Lombard, treading on the vestiges of primitive simplicity, says that Christ left us two offices, which is deacon and elder slash bishop. They're the same office. Even Thomas Aquinas says that bishops and elders are metaphysically the same. So what we think is that we think bishops and elders are the same, and over time, some elders got elevated above the others and became bishops. This is not just our speculation. This is exactly what St. Jerome says happened. If you read the New Testament, elders and bishops are used interchangeably. If you read all the Apostolic Fathers except Ignatius, if you read Clement and Polycarp and the Didache, bishops and elders are used interchangeably. Ignatius of Antioch is the first to make a distinction, but it seems that for him, a bishop is still kind of like a local senior pastor because he says to submit to the bishop and your presbytery. It really seems like the bishop is like the head pastor of a local church, and the presbytery are like the elders of the church, kind of like happens in most Presbyterian churches today. It used to be that the bishop would do all baptisms. It doesn't really make sense if the bishop is this virtual bishop that administers a whole region. How is he going to baptize every single baby in that region? That's why the bishops stopped doing baptisms, because eventually they were elevated to this regional authority. But in the early church, in the very early church, elders and bishops were the same. And then to solve certain heresies for a practical reason, some elders were elevated above the others, and they were just referred to as bishops. So we think that it was a practical decision made by the church to elevate some elders above others. But if the church has the authority to do that, the church also has the authority to undo that. And in the Reformation, the Presbyterian Church undid that, and that's why we're called the Presbyterian Church.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, because what you're describing is still the main view of Western Catholics. The Eastern Catholics, they hold the distinction of bishop, priest, and deacon existed right from the beginning, and that the words were used interchangeably. So you could call a bishop an elder or an elder a bishop, and that was fine. But the offices were distinct right from the beginning. The Western tradition, following Jerome, as you detailed quite well, I think, has this idea that elders and bishops, the way it was described to me whenever I was in my master's degree, is that elders and bishops, priests and bishops, have the same hardware, right? They have all of the functions downloaded, but bishops have unlocked certain software. So it's like a bishop can do an ordination because they've had that software unlocked, but a priest actually has that hardware downloaded, where that's more of the Western view. The Eastern view is a little bit different, right? But even then, I think you could say that even if the office of bishop and priest became distinct, which is what St. Jerome thinks, due to conflicts and needing a visible source of unity, a bishop, even if that's the case, I think that you could still argue that none of the church fathers would say that a priest or somebody who's not a bishop, even if elder and bishop, the hardware software distinction I just made, even if that's the case, I don't see any of the church fathers saying that a priest is able to ordain or to lay hands on. St. Hippolytus in the 2nd century, I have the quote somewhere, but he says, he's talking about the church tradition, and he's talking about the rite of ordination. And he says that the priests lay hands on priests during their ordination. But then he concludes by saying that the bishop alone is to impose hands upon him. He is not ordained to the priesthood, but to serve the bishop. Oh, sorry, that's about deacon. Let me see, I have it here. At the ordaining of a presbyter, the priests, right? At the ordaining of a presbyter, the priests seal what the bishop ordains. So right there, 215, right? You have this idea that the bishop is the one that ordains and the priests are involved in that, but they're just sealing or participating in what the bishop is doing. So yeah, I just wonder, like, because Luther was a priest, he's a priest, but I wouldn't see any of the church fathers saying that Luther as a priest would be able to ordain priests or deacons or bishops.
That's just not correct in church history. There were some rare examples, even in like the 5th century, of priests ordaining other priests. It wasn't normative practice, but nobody believed that they couldn't do that. Everybody back then believed that presbyterial succession was valid, even if they didn't think it was proper. So like John Cassian, in a biography of an abbot named Daniel, actually writes of a presbyter ordaining another presbyter. I don't have the citation right now, but I believe there was an example once of a presbyter ordaining a pope. So just because it wasn't normative practice,
I would love to see that if you can find that, by the way.
I had some friends working on a project for that, and some Catholic apologists, like since 33 AD, who I think has a really good understanding of Protestantism, he admits that there are cases of presbyterial succession in the first millennium church. So presbyterial succession is definitely valid. We could debate whether it's proper, but it's clear from the early church that Presbyterians and Methodists and Lutherans and most actually all mainline Protestants have valid apostolic succession by the standards of the first millennium church. You have to say that the bishop is ontologically, metaphysically distinct from an elder to claim that we don't have that. But yes, I do believe apostolic succession is necessary. So that's why I believe most non-denominational churches don't really have that. They're not really real churches. And even if they do have that succession, it's almost impossible to verify that they do.
So with Calvin, I'm curious, because Calvin was a lay person, right? Mm-hmm. So how would Calvinists not have this apostolic succession, in your opinion, or am I missing something?
Well, the first thing is that we don't trace our succession to Calvin. We trace our succession to Knox.
Right. No, and that's fair, but I'm just asking, if I were a Calvinist, would you say I have apostolic succession or not?
When you say a Calvinist, are you talking about someone who's part of Calvin's church in Geneva?
Sure, why not?
Right. So I'm not sure exactly how it worked with Calvin. We believe that in extraordinary circumstances, some people can be sort of supernaturally ordained without some succession, but the goal is that they should get succession as soon as possible. Tertullian says this, by the way, even though Tertullian's a bit controversial. We know he's not a liar. We know that he was speaking the truth when he was talking about what churches at his time did. And he said that normatively, churches had succession from the apostles. But then he also says there's some churches that do not have origin from the apostles or their successors, but they are not counted as less apostolic because they have the same apostolic teaching. So if you read Samuel Rutherford, who's the greatest Presbyterian scholastic of the 17th century, If you read Samuel Rutherford, he would say that this apostolic succession is normatively necessary and it's good order to do it, but it's not so absolutely necessary that it's impossible for a church to be an apostolic church without it. But if it's possible for you to have that, then you absolutely should. So even though Calvin wasn't immediately ordained with that succession, obviously Zwingli was. Zwingli
Mhm.
was a Catholic priest. And Zwingli, it's funny, we think of Zwingli as this radical reformer. He kept the Roman Catholic Mass more intact than Luther did. He just took out the parts about like Mary and stuff. But Zwingli was a Catholic priest, and obviously Calvin took over after Zwingli. So to answer your question, yes, all Calvinists and mainline Protestants today do have this ministerial apostolic succession.
Okay. Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, I guess so. I'll just say what I'm interpreting with all this data that you're saying. I see a tremendous amount of complexity, and I see a tremendous amount of complexity about things that really could be salvific issues, determining if somebody has apostolic succession, determining which doctrines are correct, which church you should be a part of. I mean, I think by your own admission, you would say this area of study gets very, very confusing very quickly. Would you agree with that, or do you think there's some sort of
Absolutely.
a meta narrative that I'm missing? You think it's okay?
Yeah.
So for me, it's like if it is the case that matters of salvation, and this is more of a anecdotal or an argument from fittingness. This isn't a hard syllogism by any stretch of the imagination, so don't expect that. But it seems to be the case that if there are things that we must believe to be saved, if there is a church that we must be in union with in order to be saved, and it's true that Christ wants his church to be truly Catholic, meaning universal, meaning it's for everybody, Africans, Asians, doesn't matter where you're from, you need to be a part of Christ's church. That's what he wants for you. Then it seems like there needs to be a way to simplify all this data enough to say to just a grandma, right, or a child, or somebody who's um, not well educated, doesn't have 6 hours a day to spend studying this stuff, because that's what it takes, honestly, to be able to say, this is the true church, and we can tell because of this, right?
Mhm.
So as a Catholic, I see that in the papacy and in the succession of bishops. And I also see that in the fact that the number one biggest denomination or type of Christianity in the entire world is Catholicism. So if you want to find a church that is the closest to fitting the bill of being truly Catholic and universal, it seems like the Catholic Church would be that. And it seems like the Catholic Church has the ability to, and I'm not negating that the complexities need to be wrestled with, but it has a way to simplify the gospel enough to where it's receivable for just about anybody.
I'm not sure I'd agree with that. Number one, according to mainline Protestantism, the Apostolic Church is bigger than it is according to Catholicism, because we believe in a branch theory, and we believe the Apostolic Church includes the Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Oriental Orthodox Church, and all the mainline Protestant churches. The second thing is I think Protestants do a much better job simplifying the gospel than Catholics do, because Catholics often have a hard time boiling down the gospel into like a pretty simple presentation. Oftentimes, if you ask a Catholic what's the gospel, they'll say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Um, I think
Which is
Protestants,
correct. Which is correct.
I mean, yeah, of course. But I think Protestants are the ones that really focus on the perspicuity of the message of Scripture. I think Protestants are really the ones who simplified the message of Christianity, and sometimes they simplified it too much. I think evangelicalism is a case of oversimplifying it. Um, Evangelicals used to tell me that, oh, Catholics often add to the gospel. And I would say, I agree, but I think you guys subtract from the gospel. You guys subtract the sacraments and Christology and Trinitarian theology from the gospel until it becomes just a transactional syllogism about penal substitutionary atonement and maybe not being gay. But I think that we have to have that balance between like some of the over complexity that we see in Catholicism and the oversimplification we see in evangelicalism. But I don't really think it's the case that it makes it easier to know where the church is. Like if you presuppose the Catholic Church is the true church, then sure. But if you presuppose that mainline Protestantism is true, then mainline Protestantism is the true church. But here's the problem. The main distinction between Protestants and ecclesialists is the church restricted to one institution? If you say that it is, it becomes very stressful trying to figure out which one that is. If you say that it isn't, then there are some common themes you can look for to try and see, yeah, as long as this church seems like most historic churches, it's probably okay. But if you presuppose that there is only one institution that is the true church, and maybe some people could be saved outside of it by invincible ignorance, But if you're studying this issue, you become not invincibly ignorant. So that makes it really hard to discern which one that is.
Mm-hmm.
Because Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy and Oriental Orthodoxy all have very compelling arguments to have that unique continuity. For example, I don't presuppose that any of those churches have unique continuity with the church fathers. I think the church with the best claim to have that is Oriental Orthodoxy. I like Catholicism the most out of the three of them, but I think the Oriental Orthodox have the best arguments and the least inconsistencies out of all of them. So I don't really think that Catholicism makes the epistemic problems any easier.
Interesting. Okay. So if we have time, I know you have a big exam coming up tomorrow, which, by the way, you were the one that told me this, but the Pope is a math major, and so
Yes.
you and he are cut
Yeah,
from the same
I was
tree, right?
I was expecting like a pope from Guinea or the Philippines. I was not expecting a pope who went to the same college as one of my cousins who has the same degree in college as me. Yes,
So
I am a
funny.
math major.
Yes, wonderful. But there's two things I wanted to hit on quickly, and I know we're not doing a deep dive into any of these, unfortunately, but there's two things I would like to pick your brain on while I got you here. One is you espoused the idea of the branch theory, and maybe you
Yes.
could lay out for us what that is exactly. But from my perspective and my understanding, well, let's just have you lay it out first, because I don't want to misrepresent your opinion at all.
Okay, so we mainline Protestants believe in the visible church. We do not believe the church is purely invisible. There's an invisible aspect of the church, but like Augustine talks about that, and Vatican II talks about that, people being invisibly united to the church. We believe that there is a visible and invisible aspect of the church. And we believe the visible church is basically the body that is descended from Christ, and it has real authority in the elders slash bishops that can come together in synods and general assemblies and presbyteries. So we believe that. We believe that because this church is fallible, it is possible for this church to split and reunify, just like the Catholic Church has. You have the Western Schism, where there were two popes for a time. So if it's possible for the church to split and reunify at all, it's possible for the church to split indefinitely. Now, does that mean that the church is truly divided? No, but it is divided on an administrative level. So the branch theory is that on an administrative level, the church has diverged over the years without losing the sacramental unity that it's always had since the beginning. There is still one baptism, and the Catholic Church recognizes this. The Catholic Church recognizes there is still one baptism shared by the Roman Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox and the Presbyterians and the Baptists and the Methodists and the Lutherans. Mm-hmm. So they still recognize there is a unity, even if these branches of the visible church have branched in different directions. So if you read the statements of the PCUSA, you won't hear this from the PCA because they're schismatics and they hate Catholics. But the PCUSA, we recognize, I almost said Pope Francis because that's what I'm used to. We recognize Pope Leo as a true leader of the Catholic Church. I just don't think Pope Leo has any more ontological authority than my dad, who is an elder at the local PCUSA church. We believe he's been given that authority on a human level, but metaphysically, ontologically, we think all elders have the same degree of authority. That's one of the core tenets of Presbyterianism. Mm-hmm. Now, not everyone who believes in branch theory is a Presbyterian like me. A lot of Anglicans believe in branch theory. Right. Most mainline Protestants do. But that's basically the gist of it. And I think if you really press Catholics on it, they have to affirm a branch theory, because in the Catholic Church, there's been times when the Catholic Church has split and reunified. So we have a development of doctrine. We take that idea and just take it to the max.
Mm-hmm. So with the branch theory, you are saying that God permits the church to be disunified administerially, but are you making the claim, I just want to clarify, are you making the claim that all of the branches of the Catholic Church, using the broader sense of the word like you are, all of the Catholic churches are united in doctrine? Because that doesn't seem to be the case, at least from an outsider's perspective.
Well, is the Catholic Church united on doctrine? We would have to say yes on the essentials and no on the non-essentials.
When you say Catholic there, you're saying
Sorry,
uppercase C,
the Roman
lowercase C.
Is the Roman Catholic Church united in doctrine? Right. If we said yes, we would say there's a lot of important issues that they don't necessarily agree on. But we would say, yes, but there is a core of things they do agree on. And the branch theory just expands that. So a lot of things Protestants believe are really things Catholics believe, but to the nth degree. So we would say that we would have a minimalistic view of what the bare essentials of Christianity are. And the reason we have that is because when people say, what must I do to be saved? It's not like a long essay. It's pretty simple. So we would say the core beliefs are the regula fide. That's what the church fathers talk about. The
Right.
regula fide, which subsists in the Apostles and Nicene Creeds. Is it a strict, like, legal code of bullet by bullet by bullet? No. But the church fathers didn't see it that way, and they were okay with the fact that they knew they didn't see it that way. So I would say there is doctrinal unity on all the matters essential for salvation.
Mm. Okay. Yeah, I guess that would be kind of the crux of the issue is like, is believing in the Immaculate Conception necessary for salvation, or is believing in the infallibility of the Deuterocanon necessary for salvation? Whereas
No.
Protestants would say you can affirm that or deny that and still be saved. Whereas
Yes.
Catholics, and I suppose Eastern Orthodox, at least with the infallibility of the Deuterocanon, they would agree that that's a necessary component for the faith, right?
Yeah. Well, here's the thing, like, the Catholics admit that there's a lot of church fathers who didn't believe in the infallibility of the canon or the Immaculate Conception. Like, John
Mm-hmm.
Chrysostom had a lower Mariology than I do, than a lot of the reformers did. So one of my issues with Catholicism is that heresy is about submission to the Pope and the Church rather than just objective truth. And they have this idea that something's not really a heresy until the Church says it is. So then it's not about what you actually believe. Then it becomes more about whether you submit to the magisterium. Because Catholics admit that there's a lot of things the early church fathers believed that are now condemned as heresy, but they say it's okay because it wasn't defined as heresy when the church fathers said it.
Right. So a couple things on that. One is that yes, it's true that John Chrysostom in his homilies on Matthew, he basically says that Mary was guilty of at least one sin of vainglory. So he's holding to the opposite of what we as Catholics hold today, which is the sinlessness of Mary. But then you have church fathers like John Damascene, you have church fathers like Ephraim the Syrian, and they held a very, very high Mariology that I think would match more or less, maybe with a little bit more specificity today, but matches more or less what the Catholic Church teaches about
Oh,
Mary today.
I agree. I grant that. But the fact that there are saints in the early church who believed things that the Catholic Church now defines as heresy is a bit problematic for me because it shows
Right.
that heresy is not about what you objectively believe and more about whether or not you agree with what the church has defined. Because we think
Right.
that truth doesn't change. We think that if something is a heresy now, it was a heresy back then. There's a lot of things that Catholics believe now that might be heresy in 200 years. Maybe
Right.
co-redemptrix or co-mediatrix is going to be defined as infallible dogma. Maybe Maximilian Kolbe's views of Mary are eventually going to become infallible Marian dogma. So
Right.
it's just one of my criticisms of Catholicism, where heresy is less about the objective, timeless truth and more about submission to the magisterium.
Right. So yeah, just a couple things to finish. I want to finish this up, and then let's go from here. And then I want one more question that I'm really curious. It's kind of doctrinal, kind of not. I think it'll be
Okay.
interesting. And then let's go on to talk about Nestorianism and the papacy. And let's end on a high note. Let's end on condemning some heretics together. I like that. But the point that I was just making was the idea that yes, John Chrysostom seems to be in this camp regarding Mary. And then you have Ambrose and John Damascene over in this camp talking about Mary. So the fact that they are disagreeing on a matter of faith isn't really an issue to me because the church's function is to play referee, right? So whenever you have in the early church these differing opinions about Mariology or soteriology or what have you, the church is the one through ordinarily ecumenical councils that plays referee in that. And so the fact that John Damascene and John Chrysostom don't agree about Mary's sinlessness, that doesn't pose a question to me or a problem to me because that's the church's role, is to clarify those issues. And then to your point secondarily about submission to a living teaching authority, I see whenever I look at Christ, the living teaching authority. It's like, even if you don't know what he's teaching, you don't really understand it, you are bound to say with Peter in John chapter 6, Lord, to whom else shall we go? You have the words of everlasting life, right? Like, even if I don't really understand the Immaculate Conception or transubstantiation, if Christ taught that to me, I would say, yeah, you know what you're talking about, Jesus, even if I don't know. And then that authority, I see it passed on to the apostles because it's necessary, from my opinion. And John Henry Newman, maybe I'll put a link in the description of this video or something for anybody watching later. He has a beautiful essay on this where he makes exactly the same point. But after Christ ascends into heaven, he gives to the apostles that kingdom, that teaching authority. So now it's impossible for you to say that you have the Christian faith and not be in union with the apostles, right?
I agree.
The things that you believe necessarily imply that you're in union with a living teaching authority. So then after the death of St. John in, let's say, the year 95 AD, something like that, it's like, where does that living teaching authority go? And for Catholics, we see it as being a necessary consequence, that there be a living teaching authority that we call the church. And we see these three grades: bishop, priest, deacon. And we talked about the distinction between bishop and priest here a little bit, but we see these hierarchy that the apostles and Christ instituted. And so we say that's where the submission to the living teaching authority goes. So the fact that you're saying it's necessary to submit to a living teaching authority, I actually agree with you. And I don't see that as a problem, though. I see that as the function, the purpose of the church.
Yeah, I want to clarify. I agree that it's necessary to submit to living teaching authority. I believe that the apostles gave the authority to the elders and bishops of the church to teach and bind people's consciences to things. But the church has the authority to clarify what is heresy. They have the authority to clarify what has always been heresy. I don't think they have the authority to say something is now a heresy when it wasn't a heresy before. I'm not bothered by the fact that John Chrysostom didn't believe in the sinlessness of Mary, because I don't think that's an essential for salvation. When Protestants say something is a heresy, so the Bible clearly says, if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. When we call something a heresy, we are saying that if you believe this, that is incompatible with the idea that Jesus is Lord and that God raised him from the dead. So Arianism is a heresy, not because the church said it was. I think Arianism was still a heresy before the Council of Nicaea, because if you don't believe Jesus is eternally God, you can't worship him. Nestorianism is a bit more nuanced, but if you don't believe that Mary gave birth to God, which John MacArthur doesn't believe, then you don't believe Jesus was God, and that's Arianism, which we already know is heresy. I believe Nestorianism was heresy before the Council of Ephesus, and I believe that Arianism was heresy before the Council of Nicaea. So the problem with this Catholic idea that you can make things heresy that weren't heresy before, I think that really cheapens the idea of what heresy actually is.
Yeah. Oh man. Okay. We got 20 minutes here, so we're gonna move on to the next part, if that's okay. There's more that could be said. Well said on your part, though. But for anybody just joining us, we have Redeemed Zoomer with us today. We're talking about the papacy. We're talking about all kinds of things. RZ, thank you so much again for coming on. This has been great. We're not wrapping up yet,